page 58. Now, with the spread of the archipelago, escapes multiplied. There was the hopelessness of the logging and road-building work parties, yet at the same time there was a whole continent beneath the feet of the escapees, so there was hope in spite of it all. However, escape plans had excited the Solovki prisoners, even at the time when Slan was still on a totally isolated island. The innocents believed, in the end of their 3-year term, but those who were foresighted had already grasped the truth that they would never see freedom in either 3 or 23 years, and that meant freedom lay only in escape. But how could they escape from Solovki? For half a year, the sea was frozen over, but not solidly, and in places there was open water, and the snowstorms raged, and the frost bit hard, and things were enveloped in mists and darkness. And in the spring, and for a large part of the summer, there were the long white nights with clear visibility over long distances for the patrolling cutters, and it was only when the nights began to lengthen in the late summer and in the autumn that the time was right, not for prisoners in the Kremlin, of course, but for those who were out in work parties, where a prisoner might have freedom of movement and time to build a boat or a raft near the shore and to cast off at night, even just riding off on a log for that matter, and strike out at random, hoping above all to encounter a foreign ship, the bustle among the guards, and the embarkation of the cutters would reveal to the islanders the fact of an escape, and there would be a tremor of rejoicing among the prisoners, as if they themselves were escaping. They would ask in a whimper, how had he been caught yet? Had he been found yet? Many must have drowned without ever getting anywhere. One or another of them reached the Karelian shore, perhaps, and if he did, was more silent than the grave. And there was the famous escape from Kem to England. This particular daredevil, his name is unknown to us, that's the breadth of our horizon, knew English and concealed it. He managed to get assigned to a loading timber in Kem, and he told his story to the Englishmen. The convoy discovered he was missing and delayed the ship for nearly a whole week and searched it several times without finding the fugitive. What happened was that whenever a search party started for the shore, they lowered him overboard on the opposite side of the anchor chain, where he clung under the water with a breathing pipe held in his teeth. An enormous fine had to be paid for delaying the ship, so they finally decided to take a chance and let the ship go, thinking that the person had already drowned. Then a book came out of England, even it would seem, in more than one printing, evidently An Island Hell by Malzakov. The book astounded Europe, and no doubt they accused its fugitive author of exaggerating, for, after all, the friends of the new society could not permit themselves to believe this slanderous volume, because it contradicted what was already well known. The newspaper who wrote Fania had described Solovki as paradise, and we hope that the paper's correspondent spent time in the archipelago later on. And it also contradicted those in It also contradicted those albums about Solovki disseminated by Soviet diplomatic missions in Europe. Fine quality paper and true-to-life photographs of the cozy monk cells. Nadezhda Surovtseva, our communist in Austria, received this album from the Soviet mission in Vienna and indignantly denounced the slander about Solovki currently in Europe. And at the very same time, the sister of her future husband was in fact imprisoned at Solovki, and she herself was predestined to be walking single file in the Yaroslavo isolator in 2 years' time. Slander or not, the breach had been a misfortune, and so a commission of VTIK under the chairman of the conscience of the party, Comrade Solz, illustration number 10, was sent off to find out what was going on there on those Solovetsky Islands, for of course they didn't have the least idea. But the fact that the commission merely rode along the Murmansk railroad, and they didn't do much of anything even there, and they got right to send to the islands, no, to implore to go there, none less than the great proletarian writer Maxim Gorky, who had recently returned to live in the proletarian fatherland. His testimony would be the very best refutation of that repulsive foreign forgery. The rumor reached Solovki before Gorky himself, and the prisoner's hearts beat faster, and the guards hustled and bustled. One has to know prisoners in order to imagine their anticipation. The Falcon, the stormy petrel, was about to swoop down upon the nest of injustice, violence, and secrecy. The leading Russian writer, he will give them hell. He will show them. He, the father, will defend. They awaited Gorky almost like universal amnesty. The chiefs were alarmed too. As best they could, they hid the monstrosities of polished things now up in the show. Transports of prisoners were sent to the Kremlin, to distant work parties, so that Führer would remain there. Many patients were discharged from the medical section, and the whole thing was cleaned up. And they set up a boulevard of fir trees with roots, which were simply pushed into the ground. They only had a last few days before withering. They only had to last a few days. It led to the children's colony, opened just 3 months previously, and the pride of Uslan, where everyone had clothes and where there were no socially hostile children, and where, of course, Gorky would be interested in seeing how juveniles were being re-educated and saved from a future life under socialism, for a future life. Only in Kem, there was an oversight. On Popov Island, the ship Averbakh was being loaded by prisoners in underwear and sacks when Gorky's retinue appeared out of nowhere to embark on that steamer. You inventors and thinkers, here is a worthy problem for you, given that, as the saying goes, every wise man has enough of the fool in him. A barren island, not one bush, no possible cover, and right there, at the distance of 300 yards, Gorky's return had showed up. Your solution? Where can this disgraceful spectacle, these men dressed in socks, be hidden? I don't know, just bend over and act like potatoes. The entire journey of the great humanist will have been for naught if he sees now. Well, of course, he will try hard not to notice them, but help him, drown them in the sea? They will wallow and flounder, bury them in the earth. There's no time. No, only a worthy son of the archipelago could find a way Out of this one, the work assigner ordered, "Stop work, close ranks, sit closer, sit down on the ground, sit still," and a tarp was thrown over them. "Anyone who moves will be shot." And the former stevedore, Maxim Gorky, ascended the ship's ladder and admired the landscape from a steamer for a full hour till sailing time, and he didn't notice. That was June 20th, 1929. The famous writer disembarked from the steamer in Prosperity Gulf. Next to him was his fiancée, all dressed in leather, a black leather service cap, a leather jacket, leather riding breeches, and narrow high boots, a living symbol of the OGPU, shoulder to shoulder with Russian literature. Surrounded by the commanding officers' corps of the GPU, Gorky marched along with swift strides through the corridors of several barracks. The room doors were all wide open, but he entered hardly any. In the medical section, the doctors and nurses in clean robes formed up for him in 2 rows, but he didn't even look around and went on out. From there, the Czechist of the Uslan fearlessly took him to Sikirka. And what was he to see there? It turned out there was no overcrowding in the punishment cells. The main point, no Poles, not at all. Thieves sat on benches, and there were already a multitude of thieves in Solovki. And they were all reading newspapers. None of them was so bold as to get up and complain, but they did think up one trick. They held the newspaper upside down, and Gorky went up to one of them and, in silence, turned the newspaper right side up. He had noticed it. He had understood. He would not abandon them. He would defend them. They went to the children's colony. How decent everything was there. Each was on a separate cot with a mattress. They all crowded around in a group, and all of them were happy. And all of a sudden, a 14-year-old boy said, "Listen here, Gorky. Everything you see here is false. Do you want to know the truth? I shall tell you. Shall I tell you?" "Yes," nodded the writer. "Yes, he wanted to know the truth. Oh, you bad boy, why do you spoil the just recently arranged prosperity of the literary patriarch? A palace in Moscow, an estate outside Moscow." And so everyone was ordered to leave, including the children and the accompanying and the boy spent an hour and a half telling the whole story to the lanky old man. Gorky left the barracks, streaming tears. He was given a carriage to go to dinner at the villa of the camp chief, and the boys rushed back to the barracks. "Did you tell him about the mosquito treatment?" "Yes." "Did you tell him about the pole torture?" "Yes." "Did you tell him about the prisoners hitched up instead of horses?" "Yes." "And how they rolled them down the stairs? And about the sacks? And about being made to spend the night out in the snow?" And it all turned out that the truth-loving boy had told all. But we don't even know his name. On June 22nd, in other words, after his chat with the boy, Gorky left, following some inscription on the visitor's block, which had been specially made for this visit. I am not in a state of mind to express my impressions in just a few words. I wouldn't want, yes, and I would likewise be ashamed to permit myself banal praise of the remarkable energy of people, while remaining vigilant and tireless sentinels of the revolution, are able at the same time to be remarkably bold creatures of culture. On June 23rd, Gorky left Solovki. Hardly had his steamer pulled away from the pier than they shot the boy. Oh, great interpreter of the human heart, great connoisseur of human beings, how could he have failed to take that boy along with him? And that is how faith in justice was instilled in the new generation. They tried to tell us that up there, on the summit, the chief of literature made excuses, that he didn't want to publish praise of Uslan, but how can that be, Alexei Maximovich, with bourgeois Europe looking on? But right now, right at this very moment, which is so dangerous and so complicated, and the camp regimen there will change it, will change the camp regimen. And he did publish his statement, and it was published over and over in the big free press, both our own and that of the West, in the name of the Falcon and the Stormy Petrel, claiming it was nonsense to frighten people with Solovki, and that prisoners lived remarkably well there and were being well reformed. And descending into its coffin, gave its blessing to the archipelago. As for the camp regimen, they kept their promise. The regimen was reformed. Now, in the 11th Punishment Company, they were kept standing for a week, packed against one another. A commission came to Solovki, and it wasn't a Stoltz commission either, but an investigative punitive commission. It delved into things, and with the help of the local ICH, came to understand that all the cruelties of the Solovetsky camp regime were the work of the White Guards and the ACH, and of the aristocrats and generals in general, and partly of the students too. Those very same students who, since the past century, had been setting St. Petersburg on fire. At this point, the silly, unsuccessful attempt of the insane Kozhevin, former minister of the Far Eastern Republic, together with Shepchinsky and Degtyaryov, the cowboy was inflated into an enormous and fantastic plot. The White Guards, who were allegedly scheming to seize a steamship and sail away, and they began to make arrests, and even though no one confessed to such a plot, the case kept on growing, as did the arrests, and had themselves a figure of 300, and they reached it. And on the night of October 15, 1929, having dispersed everyone and locked them up in the quarters, the holy gates, ordinarily kept locked, were opened so as to shorten the route to the cemetery. They kept talking groups there the whole night long, and each group was accompanied by the desperate howling of a dog black, who had been tied up somewhere and who suspected his master, Bakratuni, was being led off in each new group. Prisoners could count the number of groups being taken off by the number of periods of howling, but because of a strong wind, the shots themselves were less audible. This howling had such an impact on the executioners that the next day they shot not only Black but also all other dogs on account of Black. The executioners were the 3 fancy dance junkies, plus the chief of the camp guard, Degtyaryov, and no less the chief of cultural and educational section, Uspensky. A combination was only superficially astonishing. This Uspensky's biography, it was what is called typical. In other words, not the most common, but concentrating in itself the speech of the epoch. He was born the son of a priest, and that is what he was when the revolution caught up with him. What did he have to look forward to? Security questionnaires, restrictions, exile, persecution, and there is no way to erase this from one's record, no possible way to change one's father. But no, Uspensky discovered there was a way. He killed his own father and declared to the authorities that he had done it out of class hatred. That was a healthy attitude, and almost not a murder at all. He was given an easy sentence. And he immediately rose in the camp, in the cultural and educational line of work, and was soon liberated. And here we come upon him as the free chief of the cultural and educational section of the KVCH of Solovki. And as far as these executions are concerned, it is not known whether he volunteered or whether they suggested he reaffirm his class position. By night's end, at any rate, he was seen washing off the blood-soaked tops of his boots, one after the other, over a washbin. And in illustration 19, it is perhaps he on the far right, though it may merely be someone else with the same name. They were drunk and careless, and in the morning the enormous pit, only lightly covered, was still stirring and moving. Throughout October and during November too, they brought in additional groups from the mainland for execution. Somewhat later, the entire cemetery was leveled by the prisoners, while the band played in the background. After those executions, the chief of Slon was replaced. Zarn came to replace Eichmann's, and it is considered that a new era of Solovetsky legality was thereby established. However, there is still, here is what it is like. In the summer of 1930, they brought to Solovki several dozen religious sectarians who rejected anything that came from Antichrist. They refused to accept any documents, including passports, and they refused to sign for anything or to handle any money. At their head was a gray-bearded old man, Rady, black and bearing a long staff. Every enlightened person could see clearly that these sectarians could never, ever enter into socialism, because that required having a great deal to do with papers, and that therefore the best thing for them to do was die. And so they sent them off to Mali Zayatsky Island, the smallest on the entire archipelago, the entire Solovetsky archipelago, sandy, unforested desert containing a summer hut of former monk fishermen, and they expressed willingness to give them 2 months' rations, the conditions being that each one of the secretaries would have to sign for them on the invoice. Of course they refused. At that point, the indefatigable Anna Skripnikova intervened, notwithstanding her own youth and the youth of the Soviet government. She had already been arrested for the 4th time. She dashed back and forth between the accounting office and the work assigners and the chief of the camp himself, who was engaged in putting into effect the humanitarian regimen. She first besought the compassion for them, and after that she began to be sent to the Zayatsky Islands with the sectarians as their clerk, understanding the obligation of issuing food to them each day and conducting the bookkeeping formalities for them. And it would appear that this didn't conflict in any respect with the camp system, and the chiefs refused. But they feed insane people without asking for signatures on receipts, Anna cried. Zarin only burst out laughing. A woman work assigner replied, "Maybe those are Moscow orders. We don't really know." Of course, they were instructions from Moscow, for who else would have taken that responsibility? And so they were sent off without food. 2 months later, exactly 2 months became They were then to be asked, exactly 2 months, because they were then to be asked to sign for their food for the next 2 months. They sailed over to Malizayatsky and found only corpses which had been picked by the birds. Everyone was there. No one had escaped. So who now is going to see out those guilty? In the 60s of our great century. Anyway, Tsarin too was soon removed from his post for liberalism, and it seems he got 10 years himself. I must say that story of the boy in Gorky. Oh, it breaks my heart. That brave boy told him everything. How could he leave him there? Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a nice night.